Too often business owners today are focusing on the little things in business. They're ordering supplies, dealing with employees, and dealing with customers, when what we should be focusing on is the most important thing, cash flow. I've grown over 10 businesses from the ground up. In this podcast, you'll learn the ins and outs of building a business and how to build transferable value. And most importantly, you'll learn how to maximize cash. They call me Cash Flow Mike, and this is the clear path to cash. Hey, it's Cash Flow Mike, and welcome to the Clear Path to Cash podcast. And I am joined by Charles Fettinger. And I'll tell you what, Charles, I recently met you, but you super interested me right off the bat. He is what I consider to be an expert in cryptocurrency, right? In Bitcoin. So, Charles, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here, and this is exciting to be here and hopefully help people learn about Bitcoin a little bit from a small business point of view. This is great. This is my focus.
Well, right on. So, and that's exactly why I had you on, right? Is because I've got to be honest with you. I don't know jack about Bitcoin. I don't know anything about it. I don't even know what it looks like just at the symbol. I don't even know what I'm looking for on a thing. I can barely Google what Bitcoin is and not understand it. So, what I wanted to do today was just explore that, because I'm telling you, I'm hearing it more and more and more. And I know it's been around for quite a while, but people are starting to get into it, right? People are starting to be interested in it. So that's what I want to do today, is dig into it and see how you can connect it to my small business listeners and what they can do next. So are you ready?
Okay. Yeah, I'm ready. Let me tell you. So I've been involved with Bitcoin for about 10 years. I've trained up as with the Bitcoin core developers because it's software. What Bitcoin is, it's an open source cash basically. So you can use it on the internet to transfer money back and forth much cheaper than credit cards and much more securely than credit cards. And it's got one unique characteristic that makes it different than our current financial system, in that once you own a Bitcoin, if you can secure it, it's yours no matter what. No one can take it from you, which is very different than our current financial system. So when you're talking about what is Bitcoin, Bitcoin is just cash that is secure. So what they did to create Bitcoin is they solved a fundamental mathematical problem, the mathematical problem of trust, right? So how do you know that I own something? And that's the solution that Bitcoin brings. So since you know you own that Bitcoin, if somebody transfers it to you, now you have something that is a very valuable asset, because the only way someone else can get that asset, no matter what, no matter who they are, no matter what powers are allied against you or whatever, is if you send it to them, right? You have to choose to give them that cash. So when we're talking about cash flow, there's no more powerful asset to have than cash flow that can't be taken. It has to be given. It has to be earned, right? So it's a great asset from that point of view.
Okay, so now you got my mind just spinning, right? I've got like 1,000 questions, and I want to remind everybody, though, that, hey, you can find us and listen to Charles on Spotify, on Apple, iTunes, on Google, matter of fact, on YouTube. So don't forget, go there, subscribe, and listen to what he's going to tell us, because I've got a bunch of questions. So Charles, you're talking about trust. So to me, trust is the evidence of integrity over time, right? That's what I teach in my classes and things like that. But how do I trust? I mean, if I have $1 in my hand, I can feel it. I can hand it to somebody. I mean, you trust it as mine because I have it. I trusted it. I give it to you because I have it. But where does this cash come from, right? You're saying it's an open source code. I mean, where does the cash come from to make a Bitcoin?
Well, Bitcoin is like the fuel for the highway of the blockchain, right? It's like the gasoline that for the highway, right? So all transactions, if you're doing accounting, it takes time. So all the transactions that happen on the blockchain, which is like your books, your ledger, all those transactions are done with the reward of Bitcoin and the transferring of some Bitcoin back and forth. So it's the transfer of value back and forth on the blockchain. Maybe that's a little bit over the head, but that's what it is. So
that would need an episode on blockchain.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So Bitcoin, blockchain, they're all tied in. One's like a highway one's basically your books, right? And the other one is just the way you pay people to do the transactions and how the transfer of value goes back and forth on the blockchain. That's Bitcoin.
I'm trying to reconcile a couple different thoughts here. One is I hear people mining Bitcoin, but that sounds different than what you just said. Or are they the same and I just don't know the difference?
It is the same, and mining means that they're doing the books, basically. So they use a computer that's very fast to do specific transactions, but what they're really doing is competing to put in the next piece of the ledger, the next block in the chain on the entries in the ledger, right? So that's what mining is. They're saying they're all competing and it's made to be random. Whoever puts that block in the ledger gets a reward, and that reward right now is in Bitcoin. And they also get some transaction fees. And once all the Bitcoins are created in the history of Bitcoin, you're still going to have those transaction fees. So just like a bank doing a transaction, they're going to get a little bit of a fee for processing those transactions in the future. And in the future, Bitcoin will be worth a lot more than it is right now. So those transaction fees will be enough.
I've got to start from the beginning. Where did Bitcoin originate, right? Where did it come from?
Well, this is where we get into a little bit of a debate because it's a little controversial, but the truth is this. In the 2008 financial crisis, Bitcoin was released. But for the 30 years prior to that, Bitcoin had been in development because people really didn't like the fact that the dollar was not tied to gold. They didn't like the way central banks, ran money supply and stuff like that. And really, when we talk about the rat race, what we're really talking about is the financial system, right? They print money, they give you some money, and then they raise interest, or they raise inflation a little bit. Now your money's worth less. You have to work more, and you have to think in the future, well, I need to earn so much money, but I have to take into account the inflation of the money, so I have to make sure I have interest and all that. And that's kind of how the rat race works. So people were trying to figure out, well, we have this thing called the internet now, and credit cards were designed in the 60s, so they're not very secure for transacting things on the internet. And for at least 10 years, people were very reluctant to use credit cards on the internet because, credit cards are ripe with fraud. Right. So we were looking for a way to solve all those problems on the internet. And a lot of very smart people had about 30 years to put together all the pieces. And then in 2008, during the financial crisis, because it became pretty clear that the whole system might collapse, right? It became time to release it and say, look, we have an alternative. For the first time in human history, we don't have to have the government control money. We could control money ourselves, and this is what we think it should be. And since then, that software has been in development and being improved and made faster. And really what Bitcoin comes down to is the money comes from the fact that it's mathematically certain that you own this resource. So there's value there. It's really the only thing that I can think of other than like love that once you have it for someone else, you own it. No one can take it from you. Somebody can say, you shouldn't love that person, but they can't take it from you, just like Bitcoin.
All right. So you said after the financial crisis, Bitcoin was released, right? Does that mean there was like a Fort Knox depository of this Bitcoin? I don't know how it was created, and I don't know how it got into Fort Knox, but how did they release it?
No, the software was released. So once the software was released, people started adding things to the ledger. And after so many entries in the ledger, you get rewarded in blocks of Bitcoin. And at first it was a pretty big block of Bitcoin, and there weren't many transactions. So the ledger, supposedly there's all the transactions in Bitcoin go into the ledger on average every 10 minutes. It's actually a little bit quicker than that, but so every 10 minutes there is Bitcoin created to reward the people for putting the ledger together. So those rewards at first were pretty high because Bitcoin was unknown and the value is pretty low. And over time, the number of Bitcoin released to the person or group that puts the next block in the ledger is going down, and until finally, once all the Bitcoin are released, I believe 25 million, 21 million, I forgot how many. But once they're all done, then it'll just be transaction fees that happen on the blockchain.
When you talk about the ledger, my mind goes to accountants and the old ledger that way. I mean, but that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about, is it adding code to the blockchain? I don't describe to me what an entry looks like, or how would the regular person know about it?
It's very much so. Like the reason I use a ledger is because the blockchain is really just, each block is a number of transactions, like you would write down in your books or type in your books, but it's put into a chain of these blocks that is shared with everyone, so that everybody knows what transactions have happened in those books. And that's how you get trust, because everybody has a copy. And if somebody tries to say, no, that isn't correct, they have to go through the algorithm. They just can't go back and reverse an entry in the blockchain, because everybody else has it, right? So the algorithm says, no, you're wrong. This is what the blockchain has decided through consensus, that this is the truth. And now moving forward, we're moving with those numbers and who owns it and all that. So
basically the transparency of this blockchain, meaning all the transactions that have occurred, create the trust, right? Because somebody can't go in and create an entry in this ledger, right, from the accounting point of view, that changes the system, such as what we do when we create fraud. We take it from one account to another when it shouldn't have happened that way, because, again, somebody's committing fraud. So as I understand it, you're creating a transparent view to the whole public of every transaction that happens. And you're saying that the transaction happens in Bitcoin, which, and I want to get to this right after this sentence, but I want to know how we get cash out of it. You can't be cash flow Mike and like, okay, how do I take that Bitcoin that was created, because I get rewarded by creating transactions? How do I make that into cash in my bank account I could spend with other people? I want to remind everybody that we can be found on iTunes, on Google Play, on YouTube. I want you to go there. I want you to subscribe. And of course, hit that bell to be notified anytime a new episode gets posted, so you can find out things like this, like we're talking with Charles about Bitcoin, and he's going to tell us how to take Bitcoin and turn it into cash I can put into Walmart's pocket. So, Charles, what do you know?
Okay. So the great thing about Bitcoin is, because it is money that you can send directly to other people, there's no credit card company in between. There's no transaction fees like that. The transaction fees on Bitcoin are extremely low, right? Sometimes they'll go higher, but in general, they're very, very low. So instead of having credit card based transactions, you could just receive money in Bitcoin, and then there's various companies like Coinbase and other companies that you can set up an account with, that when the money comes in as Bitcoin, it automatically is transferred into whatever currency you want it to be. So there's a number of solutions out there that say, well, instead of paying transaction fees to credit cards, I could use this. There's not going to be any fraud. I don't have to worry about people asking for an order and then finding out later it was fraud or something. You don't have to deal with fighting with a credit card company about charges being rolled back and stuff. Once you have the Bitcoin, it's yours. You can do with it. You can save it. You can turn it into cash if you like, but at a very low fee, you can transfer that money to you and then put it into your bank account, however you feel.
Okay, so if I'm a small business owner and I've got a merchant account, and I'm somewhere between 2.5% and 3.5% per transaction, right? Percent, right? So at 2.5% of a transaction goes right to the credit card processing company or the merchant account company. What you're saying is that if I do the same type of transaction but I use Bitcoin, it's lower than 2.5%.
Much lower. I think recently somebody transferred $100 million in Bitcoin, and that cost them $5. So, it's ridiculous how cheap it is. The other part of it is it happens almost instantly. Instantly, when you do a transaction, the other person can see that transaction's pending, and it takes maybe up to 10 minutes for it to be written into the blockchain, written into the ledger, but they can immediately see that it's been started, right? So there's solutions that are happening with Bitcoin to make it even faster than a credit card. But right now you have to wait a little bit, but you instantly see that that money's coming. You just, instead of it taking however long it takes, if you're going to do wire transfers or whatever, it happens within 10 minutes. And within the next year, people will be using something called Lightning, or there's some other solutions. And then those transactions will just happen faster than even credit cards.
Okay,
So
so right now, I mean, as a merchant, I might wait 3 days, right? I purchase today, or I sell something today, and 3 days later, it hits my bank account. What you're saying
yeah.
is that it happens within 10 minutes. So if I'm a merchant, I get, I work with a company, and you're saying Coinbase is one. Are there others?
Yeah, there are. There's more than I can even think of. There's one called BitPay that helps businesses get set up to accept Bitcoin with there's some caveats. It works a little bit differently, but generally all you need to start using Bitcoin is a free Bitcoin wallet you can download from anywhere, and a strategy in your head on how to secure that, like to make sure it doesn't get lost, or it's not just on one computer that could crash, something like that, because now you become your own bank. So you get these free Bitcoin wallets, and then basically you become a bank. So you do have to consider really the whole difficulty of Bitcoin is that once you own that money, it's yours, and you have to secure it. So the best way to start in Bitcoin is to just buy a very small amount of Bitcoin and put it in a wallet and start thinking very hard about your backup process, and what if the computer it's on crashes, and how if something happened to you, you would get that money to somebody that you trust, things like that. You have to start considering those things.
Is that what happened to the guy? What was it, in Canada, where he lost millions of dollars in Bitcoin because nobody knew the password?
Yeah, yeah, pretty much. When
And
you become
he
your
had
own bank.
passed suddenly, and nobody could get to his Bitcoin.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
that's definitely something you have to consider. You have to consider that you are now the bank, and you have to, if you've got millions of dollars in that, you got to think about it.
okay, so
So,
overall, it's cheaper money, right? When I say cheaper, meaning the transaction is actually a cheaper transaction. It's, I guess, more secure, right? Because everybody
yeah.
inside, I'll call it the blockchain, as you did, everyone inside that has access to all of the transactions that have happened in the past, to try to make it more secure and to build trust within the users. Any other advantages of why we should do this?
There's a lot of political advantages, but from a cash flow point of view, I really think the small business owner gets a big benefit from not having to rely on credit cards, and not having to rely on a system that really has a lot of fraud in it. Even if you take credit cards out, just the regular financial system, there's a lot of mistrust and fraud. You base your decisions based on, oh, I trust bank of whatever, I trust my personal banker, who do I trust? There's a lot of those questions about personal trust, and Bitcoin trust is mathematically certain. It uses elliptical encryption curves and all sorts of, it's very, very secure.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the difference between Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Most other cryptocurrencies are either less secure, or they're implementing a technology that Bitcoin has not yet decided is secure enough. It's not mathematically certain, right? So
Yeah.
Bitcoin is adopted widely, and it's mathematically certain.
Okay. So if I wanted to buy a Bitcoin, right, it has a value. Does the value fluctuate? Does
Oh
it,
yeah,
okay. So what would one cost today? Do you know?
it's somewhere around $9,600 per Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is really made up of smaller units called Satoshis. So you don't have to buy things in transactional values of $9,600, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
denominated like a dollar bill. It's broken into, one Bitcoin is, I think, 10 million Satoshis. It works out so that one Satoshi, if one Satoshi was worth 1 cent, Bitcoin would be worth $1 million. One
Okay.
Bitcoin would be, so it works out like that. Like right now, the value is somewhere around $9,700, but you use Satoshi. So you can do a transaction that's in, that's worth $5 in Bitcoin. And the only thing you have to realize is that the transaction fee is pretty much so flat. So the smaller the transaction, the higher percentage the transaction fee is. So you kind of, at this point, want your transactions to be fairly large in Bitcoin. And that's one of the things that limits it right now, is that the value of Bitcoin is low enough that to do a transaction in Bitcoin, you have to send a significant amount of Bitcoin, like, maybe 0.1 Bitcoin is around $1,000, So once Bitcoin gets up to a higher value, there's more value on the network, and the transactions that happen at any one moment can be a larger percentage of, like, the entire economy, for instance. So, like right now, you couldn't probably buy an aircraft carrier in Bitcoin.
That's right.
or maybe one aircraft carrier could be bought in Bitcoin at a time or something, right?
Got it. You're right.
As the value grows, the more and more transactions can happen at once with Bitcoin and at a higher value. So,
all right. Hey, Charles, one last question for you. And I ask this of all my guests, but if your best friend was going to start a business today, what kind of advice would you give him?
In relation to Bitcoin, I would definitely say start the business up. Most online companies right now start with a website, and they might have various backends, but make sure you can process Bitcoin, because right now it's still waiting to for adoption. But in the next few years, it has a potential to blow up and kind of take the place of credit cards. Like, it might take a little while because we think in a certain way about how money should be. We think, oh, well, we should be able to buy something and then decide we don't like it and take that money back. Well, Bitcoin is the opposite of that. Once you give that money, it's theirs, period. There's no going back. So you have to make the decision on your end about, what is valuable enough for you to give up an asset that no one can take from you, right? So I would definitely say get set up immediately for accepting Bitcoin and coming up with a strategy to hold it until you have enough that maybe you want to cash it out every so here and there to have cash flow, right? It's basically free to accept Bitcoin compared to credit cards where you have to have your merchant account and all that. So it's easy to set up.
Charles, super interesting, buddy. Super interesting. It just got my mind spinning. Of course, I'm going to do some more research on it. But hey, thanks for coming and sharing.
Oh, you're very welcome. And there's a lot. It's a very deep subject, so there's a lot more we can talk about.
Hey, you've been listening to the Clear Path to Cash podcast, and I'm Cashflow Mike. And I'm going to tell you, see us on YouTube, see us on iTunes, Google Play, all those type of things. And the last thing I'm going to tell you is, don't be a dumb business owner.